Okay, I am back and I am reading through King George V. We are on chapter 8. There's only 3 more chapters to go. The last chapter was Restless Decade. This chapter is called Home Life, and it goes into 3 separate sections: Marble Halls, Family Circle, Sports and Pastimes. So this is going to cover life at court. So I am going to share with you if you can see it. Like, this is Buckingham Palace. And if you want to go on to Buckingham Palace, this is where we understand that this is the king's official London residence and a working royal palace. So if you go onto the Buckingham Palace website, you'll see, like, you can go in and listen to this description of Buckingham Palace, but you can go in here and you can see what the stateroom's like, and then it's got like a description of each one. Oh, it's even got the white drawing room, the throne room, and then there's a description. The portraits of King Charles and Queen Camilla. Okay. Oh, those are really, really nice. See, look at that. And then there is the state portraits hung in Buckingham Palace. The ballroom. It was completed in 1855 during the reign of Queen Victoria. It's got a whole history here of these places. So, and very interesting. So that is what that is about. So I'm just gonna, let's just settle on a picture while I'm reading. This is the green drawing room of the palace staterooms. So this is the picture gallery. I have to go look over here. Ooh, look, click and drag. That's kind of cool, actually. Okay, let's just leave. This will be the picture we settle on while I'm reading. Okay, so this little section on the marble halls, that's a beautiful staircase. So I'm just going to begin reading. This little section on marble halls is kind of long. But I'll proceed with reading. There are arguments for not having a court, wrote Bagcott, and there are arguments for having a splendid court, but there are no arguments for having a mean court. This the king accepted. However, much he would have preferred to live quietly in the country with his family, although wartime austerity could not be ended overnight. There was a symbolic unsealing of the cellar doors at Buckingham Palace on 11 November 1918. Within 3 or 4 years, a sustained fall in the cost of living, the supplementary income from the Duchy of Lancaster, and certain household economies enabled the king to revive much of the pre-war pageantry, the ceremonies, the hospitality which his role demanded. He was not an impresario like his father, but he did have a sense of occasion. The rest was more memorable than he cared to admit. Sometimes it must have seemed as if the age of Marie Antoinette had dawned again. Before the state visit of the King and Queen of the Belgians in 1921, a dancing master was summoned to rehearse the Dukes of Northumberland and Abercorn in a quadrille. Those feathers and trains which Wigram would have abolished as impediments to progress reappeared in the profusion at evening courts. Ladies of more mature years enhanced their beauty with whole galaxies of diamonds. Yet none outshone the Queen's massive treasure trove, carried as gracefully as her train of embroidered gold and silver thread, 8 feet long. The king had been less well endowed by nature, but he, too, his kindly dignity buttressed by the tailor's art, was worthy of all the grandeur that the monarchy can command. Such perfection of stagecraft was occasionally enlivened by bizarre accidents and even egalitarian defiance. The Lord Chamberlain was unable to announce the name of one young lady about to be presented. In a fit of nerves, she had chewed her name card into illegible. It became illegible. And the United States ambassador let it be known that he would not compromise his reputation for independence by wearing the prescribed black knee breeches. The Prince of Wales, more tolerant of the New World than his father, he offered to mediate. He suggested that the ambassador should emerge from his embassy wearing evening trousers over his knee breeches. These he would remove in a changing room at the palace, thus meeting the demands of both republicanism and monarchy. The ambassador spurned the subterfuge. "Papa will not be pleased," the Queen observed. "What a pity such a distinguished man should be so difficult." A later American ambassador also turned up at an evening court in trousers, although he had worn knee breeches when staying at Windsor. "We are making discreet inquiries," Wigram noted anxiously. But when a newly arrived envoy from the Soviet Russia asked the Kremlin whether he should wear knee breeches at Buckingham Palace, he received the reply, "If necessary, you will wear petticoats." Such attire would certainly have been discouraged at the king's levees, those assemblies which offered loyal subjects their traditional right of access to the sovereign. They were confined to men only. In the absence of feminine allurement, the king found consolation in the gradual reappearance of an army clad in scarlet and gold after years of workmanlike khaki. "It filled the king," Stanfordham wrote, "with feelings of delight which I can hardly describe." The spectacle also attracted the young Chicago-born Henry Channon, who in 1923 arranged to have himself presented at a levee. He wrote of it in his sprightly diary. "It is a gorgeous male side of levee, much preening and red and plumes and pomp and tightly fitting tunics and splendid English faces. We were in the queue of over an hour. Freddie Anstruther was next to me dressed as Hereditary Grand Carver of Scotland. Suddenly, I heard Lord Cromier call out, 'Mr. Shannon is to be presented.' I advanced a few paces with as much dignity as possible, and in front of me, surrounded by the court and the corps diplomatique, the king. He seemed to have something oriental about him, something almost of a Siamese potentate, and I bowed very low. Then he dropped his head, as if to grunt, and I backed 2 paces and then turned and walked away. That inscrutable mask, however, missed neither solecism nor absurdity. At a levee in the following year, the king noted that 2 senior generals were wearing 8 stars apiece on their breasts, mostly of foreign orders. Such displays of valor, he decreed, should in the future be confined to a constellation of 4. Shannon was also asked at a state ball at Buckingham Palace in honor of the King of Romania and his wife, QueenMary, one of the king's earliest loves. The years had not been kind to her, and the diarist's pen proved even unkinder. Dominic Brown and I went twin little Lord Fauntleroys in dark blue velvet, steel buttons, sword and flat hats, but without lace jabots. The Foreign Office people and the courtiers were in white and green and gold. At about 10, the royalties entered and bowed to the corps diplomatique, whose bench is on the right of the throne. The Queen of Romania looked ridiculous in greasy foam, crêpe de chine, sought delight spotted with goldfish. She had painted on herself. Her double chins were kept in place by strands of pearls attached to an exotic headdress. She was every inch une reine. The ball reminded me of an engraving of the Congress of Vienna and was not much more animated. Mr. Asquith, whom the king treated with much consideration during his years out of office, left a less waspish account of the royal hospitality. He stated, "We dined last night at the palace, and I, as I murmured to my neighbor, marveled upon the problem which the principle of selection they assorted their guests. Lord Lonsdale and Rudyard Kipling. I had quite a good talk with the former about hunting, coursing, boxing, and other congenial topics. The king was in his usual form, dogmatic and boisterous, and very friendly, and relieved to be rid of L.G. Lloyd George. More appreciative than either Shannon or Asquith was the Comte de Saint-Hilaire, who, with his wife, was asked to lunch alone with the king and queen on being appointed French ambassador in 1921. His predecessor in London for the past 23 years, Paul Cambon, warned him that the food in Queen Victoria's day had been execrable. St. Hilaire found that her grandson was to be excellent, with a Chateau Margaux of the best year, gently warmed to perfection. His account continues. The service at once was imperial and bourgeois, imperial through the origin and national dress of the 4 servants, a Scot, an Indian, a Sudanese, a black South African, who symbols the sway of Great Britain throughout the world, bourgeois, by the little bell which the king rang to call them, for they vanished into another room after each of 1 or 2 or 3 dishes which made up to the menu. To reduce their presence to a minimum, the king himself dealt with the drink. St. Hilaire, the victim of exceptional short sight, was certainly mistaken about the cosmopolitan range of the footmen, although not about the minimum number required to minister to that of parte carré. Later in the reign, when the king and queen took a short holiday by sea in a house borrowed from the Duke of Devonshire, The king told Ponsonby that he had brought very few servants. At a private cinema show one evening to which the servants were invited, Ponsonby counted 45. For all its splendor, Buckingham Palace was not what the king meant by home. It was there that he labored over his papers, received ministers, entertained the Queen of Romania and the Comte de Saint Hilaire and Mr. Henry Channing. But his heart remained elsewhere, at Balmoral in the autumn and Sandringham in the winter. Okay, so I'm just going to show you what Sandringham looks like. There is Sandringham. And this is on my list. I'd love to go see what Sandringham looks like. It's a much-loved country retreat of Their Majesties King Charles III and Queen Camilla. It includes an organic farm, a sawmill, residential and commercial properties, local parishes, and a community nestled in the heart of Norfolk coast of an outstanding natural beauty. And this is the house. This is what it looks like. So let's just give you an idea of what it looks like. Caesar, the fox terrier of King Edward the Seventh. The tapestries. So I think that might be Persimmons, King Edward the Seventh's horse, because this primarily was a house he bought for the family, their country house. It's where they spend Christmas. Queen Elizabeth first televised Christmas broadcast, and one of the first houses to have showers. So there's 100 rooms. I mean, anyways, I will proceed reading. Even Windsor inspired pride rather than affection. From the moment you arrive at the door, Princess Alice would recall to be met by footmen with powdered hair, and the housekeeper in black silk, and the master of the household and others. You felt as you do on entering a venerable cathedral, but no cathedral has ever boasted a banqueting hall able to seat nearly 200 guests and a single long table. A Waterloo chamber hung with the portraits painted by Lawrence to mark the Allied victory of 1815. A Lawrence Pourbaix Napoleon, General de Gaulle, was to inquire a century and a half later. A suite of drawing rooms, the red and the green and the white, each more magnificent than the last, the masterpieces of Rembrandt and Van Dyck, of Canaletto and Stubbs, a library incomparably rich in the drawings of Leonardo and Holbein, the miniatures of Hilliard and Oliver, the finest craftsmen of furniture, and the clocks and the porcelain and silver, bronzes and bindings, weapons and scientific instruments. The treasures of the Nibelung, explained the wife of a German ambassador dining at Buckingham Palace. She had yet to visit Windsor. Such profusion may have overwhelmed a more learned man than the king, but he took it all in his stride. Everything here is of the best, he would say, surveying his possessions. Dates and that sort of thing he would leave to his wife, who had both an eye and a memory or to his librarians, learned fellows like Fortesque and Morshead. But there was one object which he cherished, a silver gilt treasure statue of Lady Godiva. The reason was that short-sighted Queen Olga of the Hellenists had once been heard to murmur as she peered at it, "Ah, dear Queen Victoria." That came high in the king's repertoire of stories. The queen brought both knowledge and the wiles of the predator of enlarging the Windsor collections. One is reflected in the descriptive labels in each of their own hand, attached to even the humblest of pieces, the other in those innumerable acquisitions which she bought or begged. Not all the anecdotes of her persistence are exaggerated. Visiting the homes of friends, acquaintances, and strangers, sometimes self-invited, she would stand in front of a covetable object and pronounce in measured tones, "I am crossing it with my eyes." If that evoked no impulsive gesture or generosity, the queen would resume her tour. But on taking her leave, she would pause on the doorsteps and ask, "May I go back and say goodbye to the dear little cabinet?" Should even that touching appeal fail to melt the granite heart of her host, her letter of thanks might include a request to buy the pieces. Few could resist that final assault. Lord Lincolnshire demanded and received £300 for his Derby biscuit group of sons of George III. And when the Lord and Lady Lee were asked to sell a little portrait of Charles II, they replied that they would be honored if the Queen would accept it as a gift. With our humble duty, this she did without demur, sending in return an inscribed photograph framed, as she explained, in Indian brocade, which I bought myself at Benares. Next to family iconography, the Queen was captivated by the diminutive, a taste shared by most of the crowned heads of Europe. But whereas they were content with those tiny carved animals and other bibelots produced by Fabergé, she alone could display at Windsor the most grandiose doll's house in the world. Okay, this is something. Queen Mary had this amazing dollhouse collection. So let me see if I can bring up the Windsor Castle and maybe it's on display. Here it is. Okay, here. That is Queen Mary's dollhouse collection, if you can see it. It was built between 1921 and 1924 for Queen Mary's wife of George V by the leading British architect. Contributions from over 1,500 of the finest artists, craftspeople, manufacturers of the early 20th century. The house is on permanent display at Windsor Castle. And I've got a picture of it in this book. So for anybody that can locate this book, there's a picture of it in this book, but it's in black and white. So, but that way you can see this. This is on the website of the Royal Collection Trust on the Windsor Castle website. So the House of Windsor. There's a lot of things to see at Windsor Castle. I've been here. It's really nice. Was built for Charles II and his Queen Catherine of Braganza, which, if you ever have a chance to read about Charles II and just get a glance over that piece of history, that would be very interesting. But anyways, those are the ceremonial rooms. So look how beautiful it is. chamber, Queen's drawing room. Okay. And then right there that's the dollhouse. A tribute that took more than 3 years to design and construct and adorn, it was built on scale of 1 inch to 1 foot, exactly as Swift depicted Lilliput in Gulliver's Travel. The architect was Sir Edwin Lutyens, the gardener, Miss Gertrude Jekyll, the librarian, Princess Marie Louise. Their inspiration was supported by 500 donors, 250 craftsmen, 60 artists, and 600 contributors to the library. The leading artists of the day decorated walls and ceilings, painted pictures to be hung in the rooms, or contributed to the portfolios of watercolors and engravings in the library. There was a facade in the style of Wren, 102 inches long, a garden with shrubs and flowers, a garage with Rolls-Royce and the Daimler, a cellar with the finest vintages of Europe. The safe contains an insurance policy on the house. The kitchen, a set of gold frying pans. The king's wardrobe, a shooting stick, and a field marshal's sword. There were crown jewels in the strong room, toys in the nursery, marmalade in the larder. Lifts and lavatories were marvels of mechanical ingenuity, china and plate, golf clubs and shotguns, fountain pens and dispatch boxes, a stamp collection in an album. Nothing was forgotten. The donors of these miniature treasures included the bearers of many household names: Boot, Chivers, Chubb, Dunhill, Duveen, Gibbons, Gilby, Purdy, Roundtree, Tuck, Wedgwood, and Wilkinson. Lord Waring, whose peerage had attracted so much unfavorable comment, gave the furniture for the Queen's boudoir. Other loyal contributors included a lady with the delightful name of Miss Queenie Victoria Beer. The youngest was Nigel Nicholson, age 5, a son of the future royal biographer, who was persuaded to part with the miniature chest of drawers. Not even a royal commission could deter Lutyens from a characteristic joke. One pillow of the bed was embroidered with the initials MG, the other with GM. They meant, and he explained, May George or George May. Under the persuasive direction of Princess Marie Louise, who wrote 2,000 letters in her own hand, a whole library of works by contemporary authors was assembled, each volume no bigger than a large postage stamp. Max Beerbohm contributed to a whimsical tale that owed something to Alice in Wonderland. Hilaire Belloc, a parable of the corruption of political life. Conan Doyle, a new adventure of Sherlock Holmes. M.R. James, a ghost story called The Haunted Dollhouse. There were poems by Hardy and Aldous Huxley, Kipling and Housman and Sassoon. Somerset Maugham offered a cynical short story, Haldane, a monogram on humanism. Sir John Bland Sutton, the gynecological surgeon, submitted a treatise on doll surgery, including injuries to the eyes and repairs to the bellows. Asquith sent a sentence from one of his early speeches, but thought it was singularly feeble exercise. George Bernard Shaw alone refused to contribute in a very rude manner, the princess noted. The Queen made only one demand of her benefactors. She asked Lutens to ensure that she could open the dollhouse at will, without needing to summon a servant. That was the measure of her secret delight. It was all the greatest nonsense and the greatest fun. Now, a dollhouse can be really wonderful, and it can be something just you truly, much like King George V's stamp collections. And it's something you can pass down to, your daughter, your granddaughter. So I could see where Queen Mary really enjoyed this. Her husband, too, had his private pleasure at Windsor, the company of his old tutor, Canon Dalton. Queen Victoria had appointed him to the chapter of St. George's Chapel in 1884 as a reward for his devoted service to her grandsons, Prince Eddie and Prince George. 40 years later, and well into his 9th decade, he was still there. His stooped, bony frame, the Prince of Wales later wrote, might have been quarried from the same old grey stone as the castle itself. Walking near Frogmore one day with a young friend, Dalton came on the grave of one of the Queen Victoria's dogs. I used to feed that dog with buns, he said, and now even his memorial is rotting away. And he stretched out a hand to touch the bronze tail that was already broken from the body. That portrait of the gentle, nostalgic old canon is incomplete. A clerical colleague wrote of him. His dominating personality, fortified with the absolute independence he had enjoyed during his long period as King George V's tutor, had hindered Dalton from understanding the meaning or necessity of corporate responsibility. When he returned to clerical life at Windsor, it was an almost unbearable irritation to him, even to think that there were other people who had an equal right with him to voice in the chapter. He approached every meeting determined to fight over the smallest details, only to prevent his colleagues, whom he despised, from having their way. This point of view in a strong man inevitably made his colleagues miserable. The damage to our chapter life was no less than the damage to our personal life. His effervescent temperament made it impossible for Dalton to confine his expressed contempt to our meetings. He broadcast his opinions to people in the castle. A boisterous humor designed to conciliate young naval officers offended the decorum of cloister and castle. He inquired of one canon, recently laid low by phlebitis, "How are the flea bites?" Of another he said, "If the king sends that man to represent him at my funeral, I shall jump out of my coffin and spoil the whole show." Dalton became noted for his rambunctious reading of the lessons, in which he endowed the Almighty with a thundering bass and Isaiah with a piping falsetto. And when a herd of tourists tried to follow him into a side chapel, he boomed, "You must not come in here. I am just about to commit suicide." Yet his intellect was as powerful as his voice, and the king entrusted him to the early religious education of his own sons. Nor was Dalton without ambition. The royal family, who were spared his more outrageous displays, tried to secure preferment for him. King Edward VII, prompted by his son, suggested that Dalton was made Dean of Westminster. But the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, appointed a more conventional candidate. In 1917, when the deanery of the Windsor fell vacant, Dalton's hopes rose again. For although that office, in common with most other bishoprics and deaneries, lay in the gift of the Prime Minister, it had become custom to allow the sovereign a decisive say. But by then, Not even the king dared cause further discord by promoting his autocratic old tutor. The appointment went to Albert Bailey, a godson of Queen Victoria and nephew of her favorite prelate, Dean Stanley. On learning the news, it said Dalton gave the king one of the worst hours he'd ever spent. Stanford Ham warned the new dean on his first day at Windsor. It is not too much to say that Dalton has made your predecessor an unhappy man for a quarter of a century. Poor Bailey, he had to endure similar torment for only 14 years until Dalton's death in 1931 in his 92nd year. It was always with a sense of homecoming that the king stepped down from the royal train at Ballater Station after an overnight journey, inspected a guard of honors drawn from the Scottish regiment, and drove the remaining 8 miles to Balmoral. Okay, Balmoral is very cool. Let's see if I can pull that up. I had been to Balmoral, and it is, to me, it's worth seeing. I could see where they really enjoy and get a respite from just going to Balmoral. So it's just really beautiful. Purchased in 1852. There's the Queen. Yeah, I've walked. It doesn't seem very big when you go up to it. I've walked these gardens. They're really beautiful. Yeah, when you go up to it, it doesn't seem very big at first, but it's, yeah, it's very beautiful. So, anyways, so that is where they felt most at home. So, glad to be in this dear place again for after 6 years, he wrote in August 1919, and to see all our nice people again. He liked their independence and directness of speech. A few months after his death, the minister at nearby Crathy Church, which I've been to, that's very cool, it's within walking distance, heralded the arrival of King Edward VIII and Mrs. Simpson by preaching a sermon on Narrow. As the problems of Westminster and Whitehall receded, he relaxed into joviality. At what is now, and what is your name? He asked this tiny granddaughter of a shooting friend. And she said, I am Anne Peace Arabella McIntosh of McIntosh, she replied. Ah, the king said humbly, I am just plain George. Protocol at Balmoral between the wars was less stiff than at Buckingham Palace, but hardly informal. The king dined in a kilt and wore the Order of Thistle. For a small party, there were 8 footmen and 5 pipers. 3 courses were served for luncheon and 6 for dinner. The same well-regulated luxury pervaded a picnic on the banks of Loch Much, a cortege of huge maroon Daimlers with gold-plated radiators wending their way along the narrow pitching tracks, baskets of delicious food unpacked and served by footmen, sometimes a chef in a tall white hat to fry freshly caught trout. The men wore heavy tweed knickerbocker suits, long woolen stockings, highly polished brogue, shoes, and hats. The women, in a not dissimilar uniform, were discouraged from wearing trousers, even when riding hill ponies. Apart from such interludes, sports dominated each day's program. The king excelled with both rifle and shotgun, and he knew it. He could not resist writing to a friend that he had shot the heaviest stag ever killed at Abergeldy. It weighed 21 stone and 11 pounds. Then added, "Burn this rubbish when read." His skill on the grouse moor was legendary. In 1921, Eric Linklater and some fellow students hoped to have a cheap holiday in the Highlands and to earn a little money by taken on as beaters. One day their services were not required, and the king noticed them standing about. In a voice that was rough about the edges and genial in essence, he invited them to stay and watch him shoot. Here in Linklater's memorial description of the drive, they came in great numbers and a prodigious speed, and for the wind was with them, the slope of the hill determined their course, and from the edge of the kopjes the king took them down with inerrable aim. We knew by that time something about good shooting, and every bird that fell to the king's gun was dead in the air before it dropped. When the large covey came, another closely followed. There were 2, 3, 4 dead birds in the air before the first had fallen. It was shooting as the ordinary first-class shot may dream of shooting. It was the very summit of marksmanship, the non-parallel of shooting, and while we watched, and we knew what to look for, not a bird came fluttering down. But every one was a meteor falling or a plummet dropping straight. 2 or 3 of our own guns across the valley were good. The king, who had treated us so gently, was supernacular. Although the queen would never upset the king by saying so, shooting bored her. It was so stiff, she remarked of one party. I would have turned cartwheels for 6 pence. The climate, too, what Escher called cold, gray, and unwinning, disagreed with her. Above all, she had nobody to share her interest in museums and galleries, art dealers and auction rooms. One autumn, to her delight, she heard that the most aesthetic of her godsons, Sir Michael Duff, was staying at a nearby house, and she invited him over to dine. But she had hardly begun to question him when the king growled down the table, "There you go again, May. Furniture, furniture, furniture." After her husband's death, Queen Mary preferred to spend September at the Palace of Holyrood in Edinburgh, visiting Scotland's ancient monuments and country houses. To the relief of the king of political worries during his holidays at Balmoral, there was usually a minister in attendance, and his role was official rather than social. It had long been understood that the invitation did not include his wife. In 1925, however, Stanley Baldwin proposed that Mrs. Baldwin should accompany him. The master of the household, Sir Derek Keppel, repulsed her with the utmost courtesy. "Their Majesties," he wrote to the Prime Minister's private secretary, "are looking forward to Mr. Baldwin's visit, and I know you will make it quite clear that it is only want of space that makes it impossible to make an exception to the old established rule which I have quoted. For all his supposed rustic charms and wisdom, Baldwin was not an entirely welcome guest." When the Queen inquired about some confidential political matter, he refused to answer. Although her husband had allowed her to see his red boxes ever since he was Prince of Wales, "he treated me like an inquisitive little girl," she complained of the Prime Minister. Neville Chamberlain left a happier impression on Balmoral. combining a brisk dispatch of business with a love of country life and field sport. As he himself once said, "I know every flower. SB knows none. I know every tree. SB knows none. I shoot and I fish. SB does neither. Yet he is known as the countryman, and I am known as the townsman." One year, having been invited to shoot on Thursday, he asked if he might take his lunch and fish the river on Friday. The king thought it was a mad idea and told him so, and he was proved right. Chamberlain described in a letter to his sister how he flogged every possible pool in vain along 10 miles of the bank. The river, he wrote, was not much more than a dribble, as clear as gin, and with a bright sun that showed every pebble on the bottom. On just such a day, Baldwin would have shut himself up in a frosty bedroom reading Isaac Walton's Compleat Angler. There is a footnote to Chamberlain's association with Balmoral, which strictly belongs to another reign. In autumn of 1938, King George VI, he tried to persuade him to stay for an extra day's shooting, offering to fly him down to London in time for a cabinet meeting. Chamberlain declined. He had never flown before, disliked the sound of it, and hoped he would never have to do so. A fortnight later, he flew to Berchtesgaden, the first of the 3 flights to see Hitler that culminated into the ill-fated Munich Agreement. By the wish of her late husband, Queen Alexandra She lived on at Sandringham, that huge house peopled only by ghosts of the Edwardian age. In the silent world of the dead, she struggled bravely to rekindle the glow of happier days. Lord Lincolnshire wrote in the last year of her life, "Her hearing is gone and her eyesight was far from good, but she retains her old grace and charm and her wonderful smile. She never complains and keeps her slim, pretty figure." She was not quite alone. There was her only unmarried daughter, Princess Victoria, who devoutly remained by her mother's side while her heart yearned for romance. Okay. Okay, this is quite a long section, so let's see how far I can go. Lord Rosebery had earlier been thought a likely husband after the death of his first wife, Hannah Rothschild, but the match did not prosper. Most other available suitors were German princes, of none whom Queen Alexandra would have been expected to smile. Yeah, Queen Alexandra was not a fan of the Germans. Princess Victoria was sometimes considered daring in her attachments. At Windsor in 1908, she and the diplomatist Lord Granville danced all the evening after dinner, the servants having rolled up the carpet. "I thought it was quite approved of," a guest noted. One friend remained faithful, Admiral Fisher, almost 30 years her senior. He wrote of her in early middle age. "Princess Victoria, who used to be scraggy and lanky and anemic, was developed into an opulent figure with a rosy, plump face. She looked very handsome, and I told her so, and her tall figure makes her most imposing now. But prolonged spinsterhood and loneliness soured her nature. Always contemptuous of her sister-in-law's organic blood and jealous of her superior education. The princess took her revenge in a too demonstrative assault of her brother's affection. The queen suffered so much from those conspiratorial telephone conversations during which Princess Victoria poured mischief into the king's ear that she acquired a lifelong distaste for the instrument. The princess initiated unpleasant little quarrels, too, about the ownership of pictures and other possessions. This was the price which the royal family paid for her selfless care of Queen Alexandra. Two courtiers idolized the old queen, her lady-in-waiting, Miss Charlotte Knowles, sister of the king's former private secretary, and Sir Dighton Probyn, who served the royal family for more than a half-century. Probyn had won the Queen Victoria Cross in the Indian Mutiny of 1857, although few ever saw the decoration. It lay concealed by the patriarchal beard by which flowed down to his navel. In contrast to Charlotte Knowles, whose devotion to Queen Alexandra left her with scarcely any personality of her own, Probyn was as distinctive in character as in appearance. He had fine command of invective, as when he denounced Mr. Gladstone. I pray to God that he may be shut up as a lunatic at once, and thus save the empire from the destruction which he is leading her to. If he is not mad, he is a traitor. Yet his politics were not always those of the officers' mess. In his 92nd year, he traveled up to Sandringham to vote for Churchill, who was challenging the official Conservative candidate in Westminster by election. He also claimed that Lloyd George had won the war for us, which I doubt very much if Asquith would have done had he remained as Prime Minister. Probyn's dedication to Queen Alexandra, whom he called the Blessed Lady, was absolute. As her financial guardian, he could do little to curb her extravagance and impulsive generosity. So he relieved the burden of the refusing to draw a penny of his own salary, nor would he contemplate retirement. Like Queen Alexandra, he invariably referred not to the king, but to King George. Both the king and queen, however, held dear old Probyn in esteem and followed his precarious health with concern. Once he came near to death after collapsing at court because nobody could open the tight collar of his uniform. Thereafter, QueenMary always carried a penknife in her reticule. Thus it was that Queen Alexandra and her tiny entourage remained at Sandringham House throughout more than half her son's reign. With her death, in the winter of 1925, the king and queen decided to move out of York Cottage. Very sad that tonight is the last night we sleep in this dear little house, in which we have spent 33 very happy years, the king wrote. The queen, too, who might have been expected to welcome her escape from poky rooms, commonplace furniture, and a persistent smell of cooking, wrote how much she would hate leaving her very cozy and comfortable home. But having once made the break, they came to love their more spacious surroundings. You would be surprised to see how comfortable the Queen has made this beastly house. Lady Desborough told Arthur Balfour, my great-uncles, as you will remember, and sold a ramp price by Lord Palmerston. Except for some tapestries woven from Goya cartoons and given to King Edward by Alfonso The 12th of Spain, Sandringham, had not a single good picture, not a single piece of furniture or other work of art, but everything was solid, free from meritorious luxury, and spotlessly kept. There were well-equipped writing tables, comfortable beds, bright fires in the bedrooms, one guest noted. Another was enchanted to be given a bathroom with the motto, "Cleanliness is next to godliness." Round the hall, a bath decorated with roses and a row of 3 wash basins, each marked for its purpose, head and face, hands and teeth. The king liked to escort newly arrived guests to their room to see that all was in order. Isn't that's really something? When I read that earlier, I was quite astonished that he likes to escort all his newly arrived guests. When Birkenhead came to stay, the king noticed that by an oversight the fire had not been lit. So he got down on his knees with a box of matches, blowing hard until there was a blaze. But his bonhomie could be alarming. When a nervous neighbor at dinner allowed one of her long hairpins to drop into the soup, the king sought to put her at ease by asking, "Did you come here expecting to eat winkles?" The Sandringham routine required stamina, even of the women. In shooting season, they came down for breakfast in day clothes, changed into thick tweeds for lunch with guns, put on elaborate ascot dresses for tea, and reappeared in full rig for dinner. Men wore trousers instead of knee breeches with their evening coats. The king, a white flower in his buttonhole, also wore the star and a riband of the garter. Breakfast was the only informal meal, made hazardous by the presence of the king's parrot, Charlotte, whom he allowed to roam at will. Charles Cust alone dared to complain when he dug her beak into the boiled egg. If the bird made a mess, the king would slide a mustard pot over it so that the queen should not know of Charlotte's misbehavior. He found her a companionable friend. Cruising in the Mediterranean, he wrote to Wigram, "Glad Charlotte is all right and that the housemaid is taking care of her." Shooting lunches were prepared with the skill given to a state banquet, and dinner was more of a ceremony than a meal. Visiting parsons noted that 10 liveried serving men were required to wait upon a party of 8. 5 in dark blue with gold buttons and medals, and 5 in red. The food was rich and interminable. Noticing one night that his librarian had helped him sparingly, the king roared down the table, "Moor's Head is not having any cream. Don't be afraid of it. It's ours, you know." He was proud of his glass houses, too. When a friend asked in admiration where the nectarines came from, the king replied, "My allotment garden." Guests departing by train for London took with them a sumptuous lunch of many courses with wine, port, coffee, and even cigarettes, all packed in a basket labeled "His Majesty the King," which the railway staff would collect at Liverpool Street Station and return to Norfolk. Okay, this gets on to Christmas at Sandringham. So let me just go back to Sandringham House. See, this is... Oh, there's the parrot. Maybe that's Charlotte, King George's parrot. ER. Look at that. Okay, so Christmas at Sandringham was an occasion for the family and a very few necessary courtiers. The ritual began on Christmas Eve with the distribution of beef to the estate workers, a cold performance that took place in the large coach house and lasted nearly an hour. The joints of meat, equivalent to 5 bullocks, were laid out on tables decorated with holly and received by the tenants in white towels. On Christmas morning, there was the walk across the park to Sandringham Church, followed by an exchange of presents in the ballroom. Each person had his own length of table on which his presents were laid out, separated by a line of pink tape. In 1926, Lady Wigram recorded, "The Queen gave the King a picture by Munnings of the carriage procession at Ascot. The King gave the Queen a large lozenge-shaped brooch containing all the regimental badges of the Brigade of Guards. The Prince of Wales received a dozen corks for wine bottles, each decorated with the Prince of Wales' feathers in silver. Lady Wigram was given a cashmere shawl, a rose bowl, and an antique tea caddy of tortoiseshell, a gray leather bag, an evening bag of gold tissue, 2 little enamel boxes, and an ashtray. At dinner there were bowls of Christmas roses and scarlet crackers. All wore paper hats except the King. The Queen in a mitre, the Prince of Wales in a penguin's hat, the young Duchess of York in a poke bonnet. After dinner, the 4 princes and the Duchess sang music hall songs in a low tone. The King, at the far end of the room, could not hear the words and said, "Listen to those children of mine. Rather delightful with their Christmas carols." Then the King played the gramophone, La Traviata, and the song of the Volga Boatman. Suddenly there was a tune which the party thought vaguely familiar. After a few bars, they realized it was the national anthem, and they sprang to their feet. The King was in fits of laughter at his joke. "You were talking so hard, I wondered how long it would be before you all got up." The King enjoyed his role as squire of the Sandringham estate. By the standards of his time, he paid his workers well. He liked to call on them in their homes, discreetly relieved the distress caused by the death of other family catastrophes. One of his favorite stories was of the boy whom he had helped with his mathematics homework one evening, but who had refused a second offer a few weeks later. "Oh, I see you have progressed beyond me. Is that it?" The King stated. "Oh, no, sir," the boy replied, "but you got it wrong the last time." He liked to know exactly how every department was running, particularly greenhouses and stud, both of which he would show off to visitors on Sunday afternoons. There was nothing solemn about such inspections. Once he noticed that his sister, the Queen of Norway, kept a special handkerchief for her little spaniel. Throughout the rest of the walk, he kept calling back to her remarks like, "Where are its galoshes? And don't forget its cough drops." In a more serious vein, he was a pioneer of flax growing in Norfolk, and arranged for Lord Craigavon, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, to see his experiments. Not least, there was the shooting, in which the King found perpetual delight and relaxation. Much chivalry, not all of it friendly, existed between Sandringham and Lord Leicester's neighboring estate, Holkham. Although Sandringham was only half its size, the King boasted, he killed 3 times as many partridges. It was not for want of trying on Leicester's part. When somebody told him that the churchyard at Holcombe was disgracefully overgrown, he replied, "Nonsense. Best breeding ground for partridges in England." Each year, rather than 20,000 head of game were shot at Sandringham, with another 10,000 or so on leased estates. Most were reared pheasants, and here a question mark must hang over the regime of Mr. F.W. Bland, the head keeper, a stocky, bearded Yorkshireman who, in his bottle green livery with gold buttons and a squire hat, served the estate for more than half a century. For visitors and courtiers alike, they would remark not only on the number of birds, but on the ease which they could be shot. "One sees pheasants everywhere in the park and the gardens," wrote a parson. "The place is literally crawling with them. Dighton Probyn told Lord Lincolnshire, 'The king is having a good sport. They call it a sport, shooting tame pheasants. It does puzzle me.' And the king's equerry and friend, Sir Brian Godfrey Fawcett, noted in his diary, 'A great many pheasants, but alas, on the whole, not of lofty nature. In fact, some of them are very fluffy ones.' The coverts planned in King Edward's Day, they were designed to ensure that birds flew neither high nor fast. Behind wide screens and clipped evergreens lurked guns and loaders, some of them scarcely more mobile than the pheasants for which they lay in ambush. King George, who could bring down the highest and fastest pheasant with ease, sometimes have found this galling, but he was a traditionalist, and what had been good enough for his father was good enough for him. Not until the reign of King George VI did reared birds give way to wild and skillful replanting of woods, ensure that even the flat Norfolk landscape had its share of rocketing pheasants. Unlike his father, the king rarely invited a guest lacking in skill. He liked to see his birds cleanly shot. One year, Sir Samuel Hoare was asked for the first time to stay at Sandringham. As a Norfolkman rather than as a cabinet minister, Hoare and his wife were enjoying a winter holiday in Switzerland. They found it difficult to book places on the train, so they asked to be excused. Within 2 to 3 days, Lady Maud Hoare had fallen and broken her leg. The king would refer chaffingly to this misfortune as a judgment on their refusing the royal invitation. Nor were the Hoares ever asked to stay again. "What's the use of a house if you never are in it?" Mr. Pruder used to ask, and the king would have agreed with him. A conscientious host of state occasion, and a generous one in the comparative privacy of Balmoral and Sandringham, he was a reluctant and restless guest. Only twice in post-war years could he be persuaded to undertake state visits to fellow sovereigns. Belgium in 1922 and Italy in 1923. During the first, he and the Queen stayed in the Palace of Laeken, where his father had proposed marriage to his mother 60 years before. "Very comfortable rooms," he wrote, "but May lives in one end of the palace, and I am at the other end of this very large house. It is not very convenient." QueenMary was no less wretched at being separated from her husband. But in the middle of the night, she heard the sound of her bedroom door quietly opening. She switched on the light, and there, peering around the screen, was what she described as his dear, sad little face. He found his way to her alone in the dark, but from time to time his ministers tried to persuade him to improve international relations by traveling abroad. The king would reply that his father had done so in the cause of peace. But what had been the result? He said, the Great War happened anyways. He put it more tersely when asked to pay a state visit to Holland. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and all the other dams. Damned if I'll do it. Even in London, the king would, whenever possible, dine alone with the king until her marriage. Princess Mary was also there. Occasionally there was an evening at the house of a friend or a political grandee, but he insisted on uncrowded tables, dinners completed within an hour, and an early night. A game of cards might follow. Channing recorded a conversation with his friend Lord Gage, one of the king's entourage. George Gage took the king and queen to dine with the Roxburghs tonight to play bridge. As he went out looking rather fat in his court dress, I said to him, "Take some money with you, as you might have to pay the king's debts." He retorted, "I am going out with George V, not George IV." But apparently, at the end of the evening, the king did say, "Have you met any money, Gage?" And they could only raise £2 between them. Okay, this is quite a long section. Just a few more pages. More daringly, Curzon engaged the comedian George Robey to entertain the king and queen after dinner, and during a royal visit to Knowlesby, Derby procured the services of George Carpentier, an aspiring partner, who gave a display of boxing in the riding school. The French newspaper referred with delight Les Deux Georges, but there were many in England who thought it was an indelicate spectacle to lay before the sovereign and his consort. Derby was one of the very few old friends with whom the king liked to stay in the country. He would also visit the Duke of Richmond for Goodwood races, and the Duke of Devonshire for the grouse shooting at Bolton Abbey. Though it only lasts 3 days, Crewe wrote of one such occasion, "It seems to take almost as much arranging as the Durbar." In spite of meticulous planning, it sometimes became necessary to hold an emergency meeting of the Privy Council in a country house. Bed at 2:15, the king wrote at Bolton Abbey, very sleepy and rather grumpy. Since the king found no intellectual excitement in sightseeing, the queen was obliged to curb her curiosity. He once wrote to her about an excursion of his mother's. "Fancy going all the way to Scotland for only 9 days and to Norway for 3. What an expense and how impractical. Thank God you are not like that. It would drive me mad." When Queen Mary did escape on her own, she proved an exacting guest as her husband. Visiting Holker, one of the houses belonging to the Cavendish family, she brought 9 servants with her, 2 dressers, 1 footman, 1 page, 2 chauffeurs, 1 lady-in-waiting, 1 maid to the lady-in-waiting, and 1 detective. A list of requests preceded the queen. A chair to be placed outside the queen's bedroom on which a footman or page could sit by turns all night. The quaintly named page was a man at the age of 50. Freshly made barley water to be put in her bedroom every 2 hours during the day. Ice in the bedroom at 11:30 p.m. 6 clean towels every day. The queen brought her own sheets and pillowcases. When the king and queen did move from one house to another, it was with all the stately and well-upholstered progress of a medieval monarch. For short journeys, there would be a Daimler motor car, its high roof allowing passengers to enter and disembark while wearing a tall hat or an elaborate toque. For more distant expeditions, there was the royal train, painted in a livery of carmine, lake, and cream. Each coach had an imposing entrance with double doors and a vestibule. Even the headstocks behind the buffers were in the shape of lions' heads, and they were covered with gold leaf. By order of King Edward VII, the interior of the train was designed to resemble that of a royal yacht, with white enamel paint and polished brass. Queen Mary brought a softer, more feminine touch to the decor. Satinwood furniture from Lord Waring's Emporium, green upholstery and silver beds adorned with the royal cipher, frosted glass engraved with the insignia of the orders of chivalry protected the occupants of the room and bathroom from outside scrutiny. Elaborate printed orders governed each journey, often involving dislocation to ordinary services. Between Ballitore and London, no fewer than 17 engines awaited with the steam up along the route in case the royal locomotive should break down. Nothing was left to chance, from the evening delivery of the King's parliamentary telegram to the slowing down of the train at 6:30 a.m. so the Queen could take her bath in comfort. When the Empress Frederick, the King's aunt, was staying with the Duke and Duchess of Connaught in the country, she had arranged to leave by 11:30 train from Bagshot Station on her way to Russia. At 11:25, she was sitting on the lawn completing a portrait of the Duke's Indian servant. Summoned, she deposited paint-box, brushes, and palette on a chair. She got into the carriage and was off. How delightful, a non-royal guest noted, always to have someone to tidy up after you. The King's way of life depended on such cohorts of retainers who, in the broadest sense, not only tidied up after him, but also anticipated his every wish and movement. Their numbers were prodigious. Sir John Fortescue, who in 1926 gave way to Owen Morshead as librarian, described the domestic arrangements at Windsor. The royal kitchen kept 60 souls busily employed. In the steward's room, contemporaneous with cloisters of Westminster Abbey and a roof with the like vaulting, there were 2 dinners of 100 each for the upper servants. In the upper servants' hall, a 14th century building with columns and vaulting of that period, there were 2 dinners of 200 each for the lower servants. At Sandringham, Lady Desborough noted that the exiled Queen of Spain, in spite of a professed pauperdom, brought with her a lady, a gentleman, and 3 maids. It was not a particularly royal phenomenon. When the King and Queen visited Knowsley, 200 people, family, guests, and servants, they slept in the house. That was without counting the outdoor staff, which included 37 keepers. During a cruise in the royal yacht, the Marquis de Savoy's valet was seasick, so the sovereign went unshaven for a whole day. The secret of the smooth perfection of royal households, an old courtier once explained to the Prince of Wales, was to employ the equivalent of man and a half for every job. It was a calling that offered security, promotion, and a convivial standard of living that came to be demanded as of right. The amount of food and drink consumed during the stay of their Majesties with me was simply stupendous. Harding wrote of the poster bar visit to Calcutta, but it was the 150 English servants whom it was difficult for my controller to satisfy. A newly joined steward at Buckingham Palace described the welcome he received from two senior colleagues. Three of us sat down at a round table in the next room, beautifully laid with spotless white linen and gleaming cutlery, while a black liveried servant, quiet a youth, served us with an excellent meal of soup, roast veal and vegetables, a sweet and some Stilton cheese, accompanied by a good white wine. It was a delightful introduction to a new job, and, warmed by the sherry and the white wine, I felt expansive and confident. Servants of every rank, he wrote, did themselves well. There was no excess, but neither was there any skimping. The place was run as a gentleman's household, without too nice a regard to economy or finance. Food and drink were plentiful, and no one seemed to mind much exactly how much they cost. Only one prerequisite was forbidden. Staying at Windsor in 1927, Sir Samuel Hoare received this injunction. The master of the household presents his compliments and begs to ask the guests of the king and queen to refrain from offering presents of money to the servants of their majesty's establishment. The servants do not expect presents of any kind, and the masters of the household would greatly appreciate assistance on the part of their majesty's guests in maintaining the observance of this regulation. That thoughtful gesture was designed not to deprive the footman of his tip, but to spare the unmoneyed guests embarrassment. Many of those in royal employment scarcely ever saw the king. Those who did experienced sudden storms and fitful sunshine. That's right, he roared at a nervous footman who dropped a loaded tea tray. Break up the bloody palace, why don't ya? There's no record of the culprits having been dismissed. Order, tidiness, and punctuality were his watchwords. When a new housemaid put everything back wrong, the king was beside himself with rage. Until the housekeeper, Miss Rawlings, promised to have all his rooms photographed so that no object would ever again be displaced. Okay, well, that's quite interesting. I wonder if he had, it was his military training, or was he just a touch autistic? Or could that be where Prince Andrew gets it with his stuffed animals having to be placed in such a manner? Because evidently Prince Andrew has to have, a photograph of stuffed animals. Mind you, he's a 60-plus-year-old man. And all these animals, stuffed animals, have to be arranged in a certain way or else he has a fit. Maybe he gets that from great-grandpa. But who knows? Okay, this is proving to be a longer chapter than I thought, but it was very interesting. At Sandringham, he forbade odd articles of clothing to be left in the front hall, and there was laughter one evening when, as the party broke up, he scavenged someone's fan and someone else's handkerchief. On a less light-hearted occasion, rummaging about the drawing-room, he came on a dusty pile of music. "Is this yours?" an angry king demanded of an even angrier queen. The slightest carelessness or difference of opinion could provoke an explosion. "Good God, you can't come like that. You are in the wrong clothes," the king explained when an equerry turned up in trousers to escort him to a private dinner party. The culprit was instantly set off to change into knee breeches and had to follow in a cab. After an argument about who should have keys to Windsor Castle, Ponsonby wrote, We had a rare rough and tumble, and the roof of the whole castle nearly cracked from the violent vibrations of the monarch's voice. And Wigram one day received back the envelope in which he had written to the king with reproach. Your letter arrived just like this. I don't think much of your sealing wax. That the most senior and trusted members of his entourage could be rebuked with the same severity as a clumsy domestic servant as a royal failing not confined to King George V. Crowned heads, even the most democratic of them, dwell on eminence from which everyone else seemed to be much of a muchness. Monarchs discern a difference of function between a Lord Chamberlain and a footman, but scarcely any of the social rank. They may share the joys and sorrows of their subjects, yet are blind to those gradations of society which elsewhere excite pride or envy. High-born courtiers have sometimes found this uncomfortable. Queen Victoria's Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands owed its widespread popularity to the warmth and simplicity which she entered into the lives of the humble. Lady Augusta Stanley, however, the daughter of a Scottish earl, and for years one of the Queen's most valued ladies in waiting, resented that royal lack of restraint. To write about servants as if they were gentlemen, she complained, gave the dangerous impression that all are on the same footing. Lady Ponsonby, wife of the Queen's private secretary, put it more brutally. We wrote of the cold egotism which seems to chill you in all royalties. You felt they were pretty near indifferent as to which maid of honor, lady in waiting, or equerry did the work. Although kindly by nature, King George and Queen Mary, they shared an unconscious assumption that royalty are a caste apart. Chips Channon wrote of the marriage in 1923 of Lord Worcester, the late Duke of Beaufort, to Lady Mary Cambridge, the Queen's niece. After the ceremony, all the royal family, the king, the two queens, the princesses, Empress of Russia, etc., they stood for ages in front of St. Margaret's kissing one another. Royalties in public always behave as if they were enjoying complete privacy. So Queen Mary also had the quaint habit of referring to members of the royal family as dear so-and-so, but to commoners as poor so-and-so. Thus, she would ask a young friend, how is your poor grandmother? A woman, as it happened, endowed with enviable health and fortune. The king and queen could be as exacting as any medieval monarch in the demands they made of their household, not least in physical stamina. There were piles of letters, which seldom seemed to dwindle, wrote a lady in waiting, and it was rare for me to lay down my pen before 1 a.m. Often it was much later. I can even remember finishing letters at 8 a.m., having a bath and coming down to breakfast at 9 a.m. to start a new day. Palace ceremonial through the ages has also required much standing about, rather a perpendicular evening, as one long-suffering victim called it. When Queen Victoria's physician fell down exhausted in a faint after dinner, all she said was, "And a doctor, too." For the most part, the royal household, they endured long hours and quarter-deck quarrels without ever complaint or rancor. Yep, I think when you're a royal, you have to really have a lot of stamina for your schedule and your routine. I mean, look at the hours Charles puts in, Camilla, Princess Anne. I mean, you have a really tight schedule and you have a lot to do throughout the day. If on occasion courtly plumes were ruffled, Stamfordham would remind his colleagues, "We are all servants here, although some are more important than others." Yet it was the king himself who dispelled any lingering clouds. "I fear I was somewhat irritable," he would tell a private secretary or an equerry, "but you know it means nothing. Behind the royal carapace lay the kindliest of hearts." He took immense trouble about the allocations of grace and favor houses to those courtiers who had most need for them. He made discreet gifts of money to meet medical expenses, and he was swift to write letters of sympathy, such as the one to Wigram in 1918. "I am so sorry that you are seedy, but I hope a couple of days in bed will put you right again. Don't bother so far as I'm concerned. I can get on perfectly well. I thought you looked pretty bad this morning. You ought not to have come with us yesterday. Hoping to find you quite recovered on my return." There were surprise presents, too. On giving Godfrey Fawcett a pair of purple-skin shooting boots, the king made him try them on at once. "This was awkward," the equerry wrote, "as I had a hole in my sock." See, the king could be temperamental, but he could also be kind. The king had the rare quality of being considerate to the wives of the household, who were so often neglected. Since he himself could not bear to be separated from the queen, he tried to arrange for husbands to be accompanied by their wives when the court moved from one residence to another. Before the war, protocol demanded that actresses should not be received publicly by the sovereign. See, this is what I'm saying. Meghan would have never made it through the door in this day. Actresses should not be received publicly by the sovereign. So when in 1914 John Fortescue, the royal librarian, married a young actress, he arranged for her to remain in London while he was on duty with the king at Windsor. When the king and queen heard of this, they asked Fortescue should bring his wife down to Windsor for the weekend, and both came to call on her. Later, the antique rule was abolished. Mr. Fortescue was formally presented at a garden party and asked with her husband to dine at the castle. Fortescue's successor, Morshead, also brought his young American bride to Windsor. "The king was like the very nicest of sort of grandfather to me," she would recall. He applied the same system of kicks and halfpence to all those officials, although not members of his household, acted as links between the government and palace or represented him abroad. Nobody was left in doubt of his displeasure when plans went wrong, least of all on naval occasions. Approaching the flagship on one such inspection, he was much put out at seeing the lower platform of her gangway was 3 feet higher than the gunwale of his barge. "When I go for a drive in London," he barked, "they send my carriage on beforehand to see if the bloody wheels go round. I expect the same thing to be done when I inspect my fleet." Public servants also had a cause to remember his gifts of sympathy and understanding when they needed them most. On the retirement of Sir Arthur Nicholson, the father of his future biographer, as permanent Under-Secretary of the Foreign Office, the king realized what a chasm of emptiness stretched before him. So, on the pretense that Stamfordham was overworked, he invited Nicholson to come to the palace each morning when the king would go through the latest telegrams with him. It was an arrangement which lasted until Nicholson acquired more observing work in the city. The king was equally considerate to Sir Edward Grigg on his return from Kenya after a difficult term as governor of the colony. He told him, "I know what you are feeling. You've been away a long time, but no one seems to realize that you have even tried, or that you have been having a hard time, or bothered to say thank you. Well, I say thank you." Okay, this is just about done. King George had a very thoughtful side. That thoughtfulness endured to the end. In the very last days of his life, the king had a letter written from Sandringham to the Foreign Secretary, suggesting that an overworked official, Robert Van Sittart, should be allowed a good rest, of which the king understands he's in much need of. And that's the last of that section. That was a very long section, and this is the chapter of home life with King George V in the book written by Kenneth Rose. You can find it on thriftbook.com. But the next section will be on the family circle, and it proves to be a smaller section. But I just wanted to show you once again. This is Balmoral Castle. It's the cherished home of the royal family. This here is Sandringham. So, country house. It's the country retreat for the British royal family. It's been open to the public since 1977. So, and this here is Windsor Castle. Is this the dollhouse? Here.
I'm standing in front of Queen Mary's doll's house, which is for many people one of their favourite objects when they come to visit Windsor Castle. It was actually made in 1921 for Queen Mary as a gift from the nation.
The sound, but
the doll's house was designed by Sir Edward Lutyens, who was one of the most eminent architects of the day.
Mary.
After the First World War, I think the committee were very aware of the fact that life was transient, and they wanted to create a record of Edwardian England, and this is very much what they've achieved with the house. It went on display for the first time in 1924, and a year later it was transferred to Windsor Castle, and it's been here ever since. That's one of the reasons we are now undertaking a conservation project to survey how the doll's house has stood up over the test of time.
Each morning we've been coming in with a tray to the doll's house and taking out one room at a time.
The room we're looking at the moment is the King's bedroom. The main challenge is the tiny scale of the items. Some of them, of course, are very fiddly to pick up, so we use a pair of tweezers often to pick them up and remove them from the house.
Look at that.
We then look at the objects individually, very carefully check them against our computerized database, and make sure that what we think is in that room tallies up with what we actually have in front of us.
Is that?
We then very lightly dust the objects and condition check them. So look at them very carefully, and we record their condition again on our computerized database.
So I will go.
It's one of the joys of working with this sort of
Tomorrow
collection
I'm going to finish
we
reading
get to
The
see
Family
inside
Circle,
these tiny little things, and some of them are absolutely
the rest
minuscule.
of chapter 8, which is Fortune Pastimes.
If any works
When I
need
have
conservation,
opportunity,
we place them on a
I
separate
would
table,
check out
and the
those
conservator will come in and check those
if you're
items
interested.
and do any
Thank you
remedial
very much
work
for
that needs to be
listening and
done.
have a nice day.